Flynn managed to hear the retreating steps of the foul god over the pounding of his own pulse, and with a tremendous effort he got to his feet to stagger after him. Tiago raised his head to see where he was going, but heard nothing, so was a bit slower to rise. "Listen, Flynn," he said. The bandicoot waved him off irritably. "Hey, wait a second! He's getting away!" the swashbuckler snapped. "Who?" Now it was Rathbone's turn to do the ignoring. He had to know what happened to Brenda's body, if only to weep over it and give it a proper burial and move on. Well, and kill the god for trying to make him into gravy, but that was second. Nego Ajiaku's footsteps faded away into nothing, but the bandicoot kept pressing forward, ignoring Tiago, until he had edged past the bow of the ship, and the pit was in the corner of his eye. He would have avoided looking at it, but since he'd spent so much time watching it earlier, the bulk of something floating in it that wasn't floating in it before caught his eye. He squinted at it as he staggered past, and it looked almost like a giant dog in a black and white striped sweater. So much like it, in fact, that he froze in mid-step, his rapier clattering to the floor. Seeing it, Tiago's heart sank. Flynn staggered over rubble and corpses to the pit, unable to believe his eyes, and sank to his knees at the edge. Kelkor's body floated just out of reach, and the bandicoot couldn't help but think that he should be the one in that pit instead. If he'd not prayed for his friend to save him, the dingo would still be alive. If he had not been foolish that night, none of those poor people would have died, not Brenda, not the scores of others. A low mewing cry escaped his snout, and he tried to reach his friend with one clawed hand, but Kelkor's body was drifting away. Nearby, Rancor, the god of vengeance, stood in the shadow of a jagged column, trying to keep a stern face. He looked from his second-best yet favorite agent's body to his top man tied to a column, who was now a staggering disappointment. He knew he should walk away. Forgiveness is for the weak, and it was as foreign to him as mercy, but for some inexplicable reason his heart was breaking. He remembered the giant dingo man's contagious laughter at office parties, the way he would make everyone smile, his lusty stories and ribald songs. The god of vengeance shook his head, baring his teeth in a snarl and pushing his glasses farther up his nose. They slid back down. The squeak of the red rubber ball gagging Kabal made him look over. The monstrous slayer had seen him, and there followed a longer squeak with an inquiring tone, as if he were asking to be untied. That made Rancor all the more annoyed with him. It then occurred to him that he could help Kelkor without breaking character, because in doing so he could claim that he was punishing Kabal. That would justify any signs of weakness, if not to anyone else, at least to himself. The idea grew on him. As one who needs an excuse to do something, especially something he wants to do anyway, he found himself thinking up compelling arguments. With Kelkor gone, there'd be less harm done in the world, and fewer things to be avenged. If he was dead, and the families of his victims found out, they might go on with their lives, satisfied that he'd met his doom. There would be fewer prayers to Rancor, and the gods draw their power from prayers. Maybe the need for his work would dry up, and he would become one of those has-beens, the hangers-on, like Nego Ajiaku. That clinched it, and he stepped from the shadow and went to the pit where Flynn lay sobbing. The bandicoot's maw gaped in a silent scream, his eyes scrunched shut, his hands clutching his belly and trying to hold in his pain. While the swashbuckler's earlier prayer had been to any of the gods, whichever heard, Rancor's need to find an excuse let him accept it as his own. He'd pretend it was his duty. At the bow of the ship, Tiago stared in wonder at the god, wondering how it could be that a sword salesman was here, in this place, at this hour. Rancor had appeared in disguise earlier, as a sword salesman. He watched Flynn hear the footsteps and ignore them, too lost in his grief to care about danger. No threat could make him care enough to save himself. The pale man then glanced at Kabal, who had made a sharp squeak of indignation, glaring at the old man. With an almost contemptuous kick, as if he really couldn't be bothered, Rancor swept the last of the monkey root powder into the pit with the instep of his shoe. Seeing it, the cogs that had been turning within Tiago's mind finally stopped, and a small printed ticket with the answer sprang to attention from a slot beside them. The ka-ching of a cash register resounded in his head, and his eyes widened. At last he understood. Then, the horror of what else was about to happen suddenly dawned on him, and he sprang forward, screaming. Within the pit, the grains of monkey root powder sank into the gravy, absorbing it, darkening and sinking from the added weight. As they dissolved, they mingled with the other spices and the juices of rotten fruits and the blood of the dingo man. And the gravy began to sizzle. Strands of molecules change composition, unraveling and binding together once more in different orders, worlds within them making up different galaxies, and within one of them, a massive, fearsome she-monster in the throes of labor felt her baby stop kicking. In her womb, Kelkor turned to look over his shoulder at the pulsing darkness behind him, feeling something calling. Feeling an overwhelming urge to fight the current, the inexorable push toward the light, he put out his limbs to stop himself. But there was nothing to grab a hold. The walls of the tunnel were smooth and yielding. The body that he remembered should have been strong was weak and puny. No, he thought desperately. The current still pushed him, a force he could not resist, but he refused to submit. He saw the rope-like cord sticking out of his belly and followed it with his eyes back into the darkness. Without knowing why, he seized it in his tiny hands, twisting himself around to face the other way. Hand over hand, he pulled himself up, straining muscles that were not yet fully formed. The walls of the tunnel shuddered violently, but he bared his teeth and fought on. Hand over hand, he climbed until he was suddenly launched at ungodly speed into space. Clouds of blue and purple nebulae and silver wisps of galaxies blew past him. He did not have to squint, for there was no wind, and at that he had no time to marvel, because in just a fraction of an instant he was engulfed in light and thunder. "No!" Tiago screamed, and Rancor glared at him. "Wait!" Flynn stifled his sobbing and looked up at the pale man. But it was too late for Valdor to distract the Lemurian. A few steps toward the pit, and the bounty hunter stumbled over a dead man, his foot caught in the crook of an elbow. He went down, and in that time it took for him to gather himself and rise, the pit had exploded into a tumult of froth and noise. Flynn shrank back from the edge of the pit, mouth agape and eyes wide, and Kabal threw all his weight into a last desperate struggle against his bonds. The fountain of gravy blazed with unholy light, and to the shock of the three mortals in the temple, Kelkor stepped majestically from it, his eyes fixed on Kabal. Behind him, the half-moons of Rancor's glasses glowed in the reflection of the glare, above a self-satisfied little smile. Finally, the rope snapped, and Kabal shook himself free, roaring like a bloodthirsty animal. Not since the days of old, when titans strove against titans, and their battles dug valleys in the earth and shattered mountains, did the world see such a duel. Kabal was a juggernaut, all teeth and blazing eyes and flying spittle, snatching up the axe of a dead man without breaking stride. Kelkor sprang, bare-handed, to meet him, and the onlookers held their breath. The Lemurian had been known to stop a charging stag in full gallop and throw him sidewise by the horns, pluck thrown daggers out of the air and return them to their owners' throats, and even parry arrows with his broadsword, but nothing could have prepared them for this. Kabal wound back the axe for a mighty blow, gathering all the weight of his iron thews, and when he swung, he could have felled a tree with that stroke, but the blow never landed. The dingo stepped in and turned, grabbing the haft of the axe and spinning with the motion, using Kabal's momentum to vault him over his back. With a wrench, Kelkor tore the axe from his grip and hove it high above his head. When it came down, it should have split Kabal's helmeted head like a melon, but for all his bulk, the slayer moved like a cat. Scarcely had he landed with a meaty thud, he was already rolling to his feet, off to one side. Sparks flew from where the axe bit into the mosaic floor, and the blow jarred Kelkor from wrists to shoulders. With a roar, Kabal charged, tackling the dingo and rolling with him, over the remains of pirates and demons. Somewhere in the tumble, Kelkor's teeth found the slayer's shoulder and sank to the gums in his corded flesh. Rancor smiled warmly and folded his arms, watching them as a father might watch his boys tussle. Flynn glared at them in shock, and Valdor watched the bandicoot. With a grim fatalism, he was waiting to see realization dawn in Rathbone's eyes. As soon as it registered, he knew those blue animal eyes would widen, then narrow slowly and cut sideways to burn into his. Then the bandicoot would know. He would know Brenda was alive, and that he had been keeping it from him. and that he'd abandoned them all beneath Matisse, and he scrunched his eyes shut, so tight it pulled his lips apart, baring his teeth in frustration. The sound of it, while minuscule in comparison to the terrific battle next to him, was somehow loud enough for Rancor to hear. He glanced at the pale man. Frowning, he looked from him to Flynn, and back to the two slayers, who had broken apart and were rising. The larger of the two pulled the whip from his belt and took a step back. Before he could shake out the coils, the dingo leaped, bashing Kabal's meaty face with a barrage of punches. The spectators could barely follow, and had no time to wonder how he didn't impale his fists on the horns of that awful helmet. Yet, somehow, though he was battered to and fro and carried backwards as on the crest of a wave, Kabal still managed to lift a massive boot and kick the dingo square in the chest. The Lemurian was rocketed back to hit the floor and slide into a jagged fang of a column. His opponent steadied himself, dropping the coils of his whip, and wound back. The flash of greenest light on the one spiked metal ball made Flynn's grip tighten on the edge of the pit, but he was powerless to interfere. If he had even thought to rise and fight, the pain of his torturing had made him numb and sluggish. Kelkor feigned dizziness long enough for Kabal to strike, and rolled out of the way just as the whip cracked. The spiked ball rebounded from the column in a cloud of dust. Until that ball could be yanked all the way back and put once again into play, it was harmless. There might only be a precious instant, if even that much, but it was enough. He snatched the rawhide braid just behind the spiked ball in midair, like catching a viper just behind its head, and when Kabal tugged on it, Kelkor let it haul him to his feet. Kabal braced himself and tried to tear it free, but the dingo used that momentum, bounding over the rubble between them in two great leaps. Kabal stumbled backwards off balance, and when they collided, even Rancor winced. The two of them hit the floor a dozen feet away, almost at the edge of the pit, and the Lemurian wasted no time. Digging his boots into footholes made by dead men and demons behind him, he hooked his claws under the rim of Kabal's girdle. Pushing hard with his strong legs and pulling with his hands, he shifted the slayer just far enough across the tiles to dip the horned helmet over the edge. Kabal tried to shove him off, but Kelkor kicked blindly, looking for something else to push against. When he found purchase, he put every ounce of his strength into driving Kabal further out over the gravy. When the slayer's helmet was being tapped by the bobbing pineapple, the dingo scrambled to his feet. Kabal tried to kick him desperately, which is exactly what the Lemurian counted on. Catching the boot, he wrapped his arm around it tightly and leaned back, putting pressure on the foot. Kabal howled, feeling his ankle about to break, but could do nothing but flail his arms. He arched his back, accidentally dipping his head into the gravy. He felt the fluid entering his ears, feeling like it was filling his entire head, which made him even more desperate. Thrashing wildly, he tried to kick Kelkor with his other leg, but was clumsy at best. The Lemurian leaned even farther backward, snapping the ankle, and shoved the screaming Kabal headfirst into the pit. The gravy that had been just recently stopped fountaining began to bubble and sputter over the monstrous slayer's mouth. This time, however, the only sound was a gurgling scream. Kelkor held on tightly, keeping his enemy's back arched painfully so it was impossible for him to break away, and eventually Kabal's sputtering dwindled away and the massive body went limp. Kelkor kept holding him, just in case he was pretending to be dead, because that is exactly what he would have done in his place. He did not relax, not even an instant, and grinned evilly when his patience was rewarded. Realizing he'd fooled no one, Kabal thrashed about even more urgently, throwing up such a tumult that the onlookers recoiled in surprise. But now Kabal was so close to the inevitable and involuntary gasp for breath that he had no strength left. It was all he could do just to keep from opening his mouth again. The pain in his ankle was unbearable. His lungs burned. Fingers scrabbling at the edge of the pit found it slippery with algae, with no cracks between the bricks to afford him a hold. Then, to his horror, his chest heaved and his mouth gaped open. The pleasant taste of the gravy surged into him, and the roaring in his ears faded to a whisper. He became very heavy, and the pain subsided. He felt all the anger and resentment he had carried just evaporate, like the memory of a nightmare upon waking, and he allowed himself to melt into oblivion, embracing the peace that comes at last to every dying thing.